7, respecting ancestors who had cared for the land previously. So that was the underpinning of Pathways 1. And it's also, it's important to celebrate that accomplishment, its influence on conservation, relationships. To me, conservation is about relationships occurring now, and to think globally and celebrate it internationally. Because I was at the Earth Summit in 1992, the vision was to do this, but it didn't happen. And there's very few examples in the globe. So it's important, and I'm delighted that we're working with ECCC as well as CRP and the organization that I'm with, Plenty Canada, to celebrate this occurrence, this process, and hopefully ignite and further to add more fuel to that beautiful fire of cooperation for the love of our Mother Earth. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say here. And I've asked Marilyn to open us, acknowledging the importance of water, a sacred element. And so I'm going to turn things over to Marilyn.
Mino desab, mina kinawea, nabishque dish na cosmocado dem, minadogaming, Shawanaga, First Nation, Dunjaba. I gave greetings to all living things, and I introduced myself to my spirit name that I've carried before I even came to this land. It was passed down from my grandfather. Nabish means water. We know that because of Nibi. But Nabish is a special place of water. And the responsibility that I was given at 2.5, 3 years old, receiving that spirit name, was to take care of the wetlands, the ponds where many of our animals and species live, and the rivers. That is that responsibility. The medicines grow in those places. Some of them are very strong medicines. And our water animals, whom I consider the scientists, a mink, a beaver, who can create a bigger community overnight where we are still drawing plans on how to do it. So I accept that responsibility with great care. And in acknowledging the lands we are visiting today, to acknowledge the ancestors and their ancestors and the generations that look down now to the 7th one that is here. We've celebrated the spirit of life in that fire when the Wingush medicine, the sweetgrass medicine, was lighted to this morning. The other source of life, of where we all came from, our first water lodge, our first lodge that we lived in, was within our mothers. But I want to talk specifically today and honor one great person that left a legacy not to be forgotten. That is the Basque Iban Gokmis Josephine Mandaman Ba. That woman went for vision quest. When she was 70 years old, or 60 years old, I'm sorry, she walked the Great Lakes because in her vision, that time that she went to sit with the spirit people. She heard the spirit of the water. She heard the spirit of the animals, the plants, the flyers, the crawlers, and their desperation for the clean water, as it once was. Twice, she walked around the Great Lakes. She walked this St. Lawrence River, St. Lawrence River. And she went to that sacred place that Creator gifted for all living things in Maintenant, Quebec, where that salt water becomes fresh water. And in our time, we sing songs that are thousands of years old because we have an oral teaching, a way of learning, and a way of knowing. And what I'm going to offer was in our time to acknowledge the leadership of that Gokum, that grandmother, her strength. And at the end of the day, when we leave here as relatives, which we are, we will bond with a different direction, a different thought. Oh. Those three lines simply say, I love you, water. The second one talks about thanking the water for the life, and life being able to carry on as hard as that water struggles. And the last line is for us to always remember respect. Respect of the land where the water lives, that great grandmother. I'm going to offer some because I know that underneath us is Earth's woman. The rug will dry, without clean life, that will spot on the rug. I'm asking you to acknowledge, I know, I see my friend over there praying, gosh, woman, pick up that, what did Peter say, that remote? Our elder on the west, he confused the microphone, pushing the buttons on it. I want to have my own remote, he said. Well, we gave him one, but I'd like to acknowledge him. I'd like to acknowledge the bundles that sit here. and the long-term learning about how to care for them. And caring for them is sharing them. I'd also like to take the time to thank our beautiful and sacred men. Why? Because of the ethical space that you provide for us. The ethical space is that place between the sky world where you sit with the sacred fire bundles and the place on earth. There is a space called air. I was permitted to fly across your territory in that airspace. My voice is being conducted and shared through ethical space as well. I want to let you know, all of you men, I thank you for your leadership, taking care of the communities, being the warriors, and being able to love all things. You're beautiful. And we are marking a celebration meant for you. We just passed through Minito Gizons, Little Spirit Moon. It is the beginning of the winter sleeping moons, where your work, keeping community and value and that little flicker of flame strong through the winter coming months is great. And we celebrate the last berry of the year. That is the cranberry. That is for you, and when you examine that berry, it describes your strengths. So let's have a very good celebration. I'm going to feed the bundle and pass the feather back to Larry. Miigwech for listening.
To our elders, thank you so much for imparting your beautiful knowledge and wisdom with us this morning. And we're reminded that there is a lot of work to do to care for Mother Earth, as you say, and I feel our grandmother's spirits with us. So thank you so much. I'm just so touched. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Canada Pavilion at COP15, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lauren Small, and I'm the director of the Canada Pavilion for Environment and Climate Change Canada. Bonjour à tous. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue au Pavillon du Canada pour la COP 15. Et merci de vous rejoindre à nous aujourd'hui. Je m'appelle Lauren Small et je suis la directrice pour le Pavillon du Canada. C'est avec plaisir que je vous présente notre premier événement ce matin, en route vers l'objectif 1 du Canada, appliquer la réconciliation dans un processus politique de niveau national, organisé par Plenty Canada. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our first event of the day, Pathway to Canada, Target 1, Embodying Reconciliation. Pardon me. Level policy process hosted by Plenty Canada. I would warmly like to welcome Elder Larry McDermott to open the event. Larry McDermott is an Algonquin from Chabot, Abijiwan First Nation, as the Executive Director of Plenty Canada, an Indigenous NGO. Larry attended, like he said, the 1992 Earth Summit that launched the Treaty Conventions on Climate Change and Biodiversity and subsequent meetings. Larry served as an elder into the Canada Pathway to Target 1 process under a system inclusive of Indigenous and Western knowledge systems and governance. He received an honorary doctorate of laws from the University of Guelph and was a humble student for many years of the late Algonquin elder grandfather William Commanda, who created the Circle of All Nations organization. Please join me in welcoming Elder Larry McDermott. Thank you so much.
Chimigwech, thank you very much. Okay, we'll move right into the agenda. I'm going to invite the panelists to take a few minutes in just introducing themselves and any initial thoughts that they may have. And I think, yeah. You were going to go first. Don, would you like to start the intro?
Did you just make me go first, Curtis?
You can get them later.
Thank you, Elder Larry and Elder Marilyn. It's really a pleasure to be here on this panel with my esteemed colleagues as well. My name is Dawn Carr. When the Pathway to Canada Target 1 started, my role was just more in process. And in conversation with so many beautiful people that I met along the way, I learned more about how to introduce myself. I'm non-Indigenous. My family came from England on both sides to Canada, what is known as Canada today, in the 17 and 1800s. I have two beautiful children, Maddie and Wesley Carr, and my partner, husband, David. And I do want to thank them for enabling me to be here today to share this story. They're looking after things at home. But I do want to touch on, just in my own quick introduction here, what Elder Larry said at the beginning, that conservation is really about relationships. And I've come to really deeply understand and learn about that through the Pathway to Canada Target 1. That's probably what I'll end up focusing on. But for now, just as an introduction, Dawn Carr, I'm really pleased to be here today. I've fallen in love with these people and panelists that I'm up here with. So I'll pass it to you, Julie.
Miigwech. Tansi, Julie Boucher, Nisikosum. I'm the Director of Conservation Partnerships at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And it's kind of fitting that I follow Dawn in the introductions because Dawn to me represents sort of the beginning of Pathway, being there from the inception, making her contributions to how Pathway was set up. And I came in later. I co-chair the National Steering Committee to Pathway to Target 1, which is where we sit with our provincial and territorial and Indigenous and Parks Council partners and try to advance area-based conservation, including Indigenous-led area-based conservation. And I only joined recently, so a lot of my experience I'm going to share today is only what I've been able to garner since I've joined the Pathway. But a little bit like Dawn, at home I'm married to a proud Métis man who's taking care of our little one right now, and well, not so little, she's 13, and allowing me to be here and to just be able to bask in the wisdom of both Elder Larry and Elder Marilyn. So I'm quite pleased to be here, and I hope that you'll enjoy the session and learn a little bit more about where it came from and where we're heading next. So I'll pass it over to Chloe.
Thank you, Julie. Etlanetea, sezi Chloe Dragon Smith Soulier, denendes diasti, set I ama Brenda Dragon Houlier, set I aba Leonard Smith Houlier. My name is Chloe Dragon Smith. I'm from Denende, which is our Dene word for the Northwest Territories. My mother's name is Brenda Dragon, and my father is Leonard Smith. My maternal ancestors were Dene Saint-Liné, and we lived from the area of northern Saskatchewan and Alberta, traveling up, following caribou through Yellowknife area, which is where I grew up, Fort Smith area, which is where my mom grew up, and up to the tundra and back. My mom's family settled around Fort Smith, and she met my father, who is of German-Polish descent. His family came to Canada in a situation that was kind of similar to what's happening today on the Russian border, where Ukraine was. That's where they kind of lived, and there was a war around the time when his ancestors decided to leave and come to Canada. So they met in Yellowknife and decided to raise their family in the north, which I am really grateful for, because I was able to connect with those lands of my maternal ancestors, you know, where we came from originally, and to be raised in connection with those that my ancestors have evolved with since time immemorial. So always grateful to my family. On the Pathway to Canada Target 1, I sat on the National Advisory Panel, and I'd like to also point out Alison Woodley in the back, who was on the National Advisory Panel with me. I was recruited for the panel as a youth member, and I really didn't know what I was getting into. I was 27 years old, and I had no background really in conservation, except for you know, coming from a place where I was connected with my lands and my family, and I cared a lot about that. So that's about all I knew. And the National Advisory Panel was the panel directly advising the ministers, and there was a wide representation on that panel. So we had Indigenous representation, conservation, forestry, agriculture, mining. So it was a whole bunch of different perspectives together. And what I quickly realized was that not only was I the youth on the panel, I was also the only northern representative, and I was one of several Indigenous representatives. And so the hats that I was wearing seemed really, really big, and I had a steep learning curve. And I'll definitely speak to that on this panel, but I'm grateful for the pathway as something that really shaped my own thinking around conservation, but also worldview and in the way I kind of approach everything. So I'm here today from where I live now in Wood Buffalo National Park with my partner Robert, who's here as well. We make a fairly monumental effort to leave our home, which is off-grid on the land, 2 hours from the nearest community. So really grateful to have put in that effort to be here today, and honored to be on the panel. Thank you.
I have my own remote. Well, I did introduce myself a little bit earlier. And how I'm going to speak is, you can guess how vintage I am. I was born at a time where our peoples still lived on the lands and waters. And we lived from them respectfully because we were taught how. I was born before a time of plastic. Can you imagine? To know the purity of not having that clutter. I know the sounds of the wind, and I know the songs from which they breathe. I understand the relationship with the water because I was taught by my ancestors. I know about hunting and how to do that respectfully because I had grandfathers, a good father, and uncles to teach me. I know what it is to live in a simplistic manner because there was no other way. Everything had multi-purposes. We had a wood stove. We look at wood stove and how many components. It cooked, it heated. Oven warmer above was kind of like today's microwave. A water reservoir, so that one piece of gear was multifunctional. And I also came from a time where people in our communities didn't have hydro because it didn't exist. I can't tell you how beautiful it was then when you went out at night and you didn't see a light up or down the bay for miles. Wasn't polluted with that type of energy. "15 years ago or so, my husband and I left Toronto. And we went back and we lived on an island, which we had been caretakers for quite some time. In our early 20s, we built that home. So, knowing how to live from the land and with the land and the water. If the wind was blowing from the north, we didn't have a lot of insulation because when we built that house, we were young, didn't have a lot of money to put insulation in. So you just moved to the other side of the room where the south was. No wind coming from that way. And we manufactured that. When I left the city, that home that we lived in, had a great big beautiful jacuzzi 6 feet from my bed. When I moved to the island, I still had a jacuzzi, but it looked like a Tupperware, one of those Rubbermaid Tupperwares, you know, long enough to get in, 2 pails of water instead of, I don't know how many gallons that we paid the city to have a bath. So we know how to be resourceful. Something gets away on us, and we unlearn the resourceful. I advocate to live a fairly green life, natural life. My sister will be 80 next week. We are the last 2 women in our village that understand, can move through those waters day and night, just like we did when we were kids. If you get an opportunity to come and fish with us, that is an opportunity you'll remember. You'll be telling your grandkids. Why is that? Because we were taught in a good way. Back in the time, there were cigarettes, straight cuts. The old grannies used to smoke those. But before anything, they would put a little bit to the ground outside. That became a way of life, a way of ask. Nothing is impossible. Miigwech. You got your own mic.
So does he. I wasn't even going to speak.
Great. Sago, greetings, good morning, everyone. My name is Curtis Skur. I'm Director of Environment at the Assembly of First Nations. I'm Mohawk from the Tainanga Territory, Southern Ontario, Turtle Clan, member of the Mohawks of the Bay Quinte First Nation. I did it to myself, Don, so I have to follow all of this. So strategy is a little off, I guess, but I've been raised to defer to my elders and to those who came before me and to charted that path. And so everyone up here, I've learned so much from you all, and I'm so gracious and just I'm honored to be here with you all, and all of you. I thank you all for taking the time to come and spend a few minutes with us. There's been so much that's happened over the last number of years. It's hard to fit that all into 2 hours, and we're going to endeavor to do that. But I think Dawn sort of hit the nail on the head, saying that this was really an effort and a journey kind of born out of a deep love and gratitude and respect for Mother Earth, for the land, for one another. And that's really what kind of drove us to be here and to do the good work that I think has occurred over the last 5, 6, 7 years now, and that I think really comes through in that report that some of you have in front of you, We Rise Together. That's a report that tells a story of love and respect and humility, and just a caring for one another and everyone around the table. But getting back to that, paying homage to those who came before us, and that deep and profound sense of love, I'd be remiss if I didn't pass my gratitude and make mention of Nadine Crooks, who is here with us in the audience. We are the product of Nadine's leadership and vision, and I think that has gotten lost a bit in remembering that it was Nadine and her team at Parks Canada that really began this work so many years ago. And the torch has been passed, of course, but I would venture to say that we wouldn't be here, and that this process wouldn't have been the success that it's been if not for the leadership of Nadine and her team. So I'd like to start there, and have you all know that Indigenous-led conservation, Indigenous leadership in this process began from the start. It began inside, and it's created the space and the pathway for us to walk this together in ethical space, and to bring so many wonderful experiences together, to be working with one another. In my short-lived career, I'm still a young man, but I would say that there's been very few processes that have walked the talk of ethical space from beginning to where we are now. And so being a part of that, being able to contribute to that, I've participated as a member of the National Steering Committee under the pathway, a co-chair of the National Steering Committee IPCA working group, and was very, very, very fortunate to be a member of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, where, much like Chloe, it was a crash course in conservation for me, but I learned so much from Elder Larry, from our brother Steve Anita, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but from so many of those folks, Eli Enns, Danica Littlechild, the list goes on. But it was really the most fulsome, collaborative, ethical process that I have been a part of. And so looking forward to being able to share a bit more about that, and for you all to learn from these wonderful people up here on the stage. So, Nyawan, thank you very much, and hand it back to you, Larry.
I'm still getting used to the fact we all have a mic. Well, I'm really glad that you've honored Nadine's efforts. To me, Nadine had the amazing skill set to be able to negotiate what was needed within the bureaucracy, but also to understand what was needed to make the Indigenous parallel stream work well. And Nadine, I sort of inferred it yesterday when I ran into you at the restaurant, but I'm going to invite the panel to share their thoughts about the original vision of conservation between Indigenous and colonial peoples and the origins of the Pathway Canada Target 1 process. And as you heard, Stephen, he's actually in the air somewhere on his way here. But I'm going to invite you to join us. Either come on up here, or I bring the mic to you, and of course, one option. Oh, you've got. Thanks, Lauren. Maybe we'll start there, because would you prefer to start or finish?
I'm trying to think, learn from Curtis, so maybe start, if it's okay.
Good one.
Kleko for your kind words. I would just say that the lesson that I took away from the pathway was really one of relationships. And fundamentally, I think that's what grounded the intent at the beginning and the efforts to build processes that were grounded in relationship, grounded in respect, and sometimes that might have been harder than it looked at the surface because our bureaucracies aren't always prepped or primed for that kind of collaboration. So there were many, many, many people, every single person on that stage, Allison, others, every person who was a member of the pathway. In that first ceremony that you, Larry, and Elder Reg led us through, I think started us off in a way that the individual and joint commitment that we made through ceremony became such an important touch point when inevitably we hit rough waters, that that we weren't certain where things had to go, but that became an important touch point. And I appreciate the recognition, but it was nothing more than what my own elders from my own community have taught me over the course of my life, which is to listen and then to act. And so I think it's it's nothing more or less than just living respect by deep listening with your heart and with your not only your mind, and then making the efforts, taking the steps, doing the hard work that needs to be done. And sometimes it worked out and sometimes it didn't. But it was the ceremony and it was the relationships with everyone around that I think where I drew strength to continue on in some of those harder moments was the relationships. Was I could turn and see faces and feel such a sense of commitment and dedication to follow through on the wisdom that was being shared, and so I'm really grateful for that. It was a really fundamental experience, and it will always be a part of my own learning and hopefully my own path as I move forward. So really appreciate that. Kleko, kleko, everyone.
Chimigwech, Nadine. Don?
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, Elder Larry. I'm reflecting on the question, Larry, just about learning about Canada's origin story and how that origin story sort of impacted how we moved forward with the Pathway to Canada Target 1. And for those of you that are in the room, our effort around Pathway to Canada Target 1 was to help figure out how to reach protecting 17% of Canada at the time by 2020. That was our goal. And here in Montreal, we're talking about 30 by 30. But back in 2017 when this started, I just reflect that we were really looking at a process. We were trying to figure out, how do we do this work in a good way? And in a good way was a phrase that I really picked up and learned back in 2017 when this began. My role at the time, I was the executive director of the Canadian Parks Council, which is a federal, provincial, territorial government forum, and it included members of the national, provincial, and territorial park agencies. It's a very colonial forum. It's very much a relationship between provincial, federal governments, and it was tasked to the Canadian Parks Council at the time to figure out how we move forward on Canada Target 1, which was Aichi Target 11. And we were really fortunate at that time to have a group of deputy ministers that enabled the Canadian Parks Council to put together a working group to think about what might this look like. So you talk about process, Larry, and the process was so important. Nadine from Parks Canada, and Scott Jones, who's going to be here. He, at the time, was the executive director of Alberta Parks. They were co-chairs of this process, and I would say they thought very deeply, the three of us, and then the team grew and it expanded, but thought very deeply about how do we make this an inclusive process? Who should be at the table? I don't think that kind of question gets asked enough. And we took time and thought about it, and a process was developed that ended up growing and expanding and being very inclusive of different ways of knowing, bringing in different worldviews, really taking the time to understand those different perspectives, and then how we would move forward together to create the action that is needed to love Mother Earth the way that she needs to be loved. So I would just reflect and say that this process has had a significant impact on me. I'm a different person because of it. I'm better in the work that I do. I've moved positions. I now work very proudly with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which is looking at land from a different perspective. And I was sad, to be honest, when I left my former position with the Canadian Parks Council because of the work that we did around the pathway and the important work that was being done. But moving into a different area and different role, my community just only grew. So our work together and the Pathway to Canada Target 1 and what we're actually doing to figure out how we protect biological diversity in Canada has changed significantly, I think, because of those relationships. We care about each other, and we're looking, you know, across rooms, across organizations, to figure out how we can help each other do our work in a good way. So I'm so grateful for everything that I learned from you, Elder Larry, and my other colleagues, from coast to coast to coast. It's my heart is full because of it, and I know my work is a lot better. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Miigwech, Don. Julie?
Well, Elder Larry, if you permit, I'd like to anchor this question in particular because, as I mentioned at the beginning, I was not there at the beginning of the pathway process and what led to the We Rise Together report. So I'd like to hear what everybody else has to say, and maybe I'll anchor and say a few words about what I take from that and what it means for me being on the NSC now.
Certainly. Chloe?
Thank you. I think for me, when I think about the origin of Canada, thank you, I think about treaties, and then I think about what is the meaning of a treaty. And I think the point I'm at now, and I'm always changing and growing and getting better understandings, but of where I am today, I see it as this word we keep coming back to is relationship, and a continued relationship with boundaries and expectations, and it's dynamic, and things go wrong, and we turn to each other, and we move, and there's rupture, and there's repair, and we come together, and we're on a path and a journey together. And I think maybe today that understanding of treaty gets lost in a lot of contexts where, we make an agreement and we sign it and we move forward, but maybe these pieces of continued relationship aren't upheld in the way that the true meaning of treaty to me is carried out. And I think I can illustrate it from where I am today, living on the land with Robert. We understand really, I think, a lot more of what it means to be in a treaty understanding with the species and the animals and the land around us, and how each nation of humans or grouse or wolves or moose have their roles and responsibilities on the land. And what it means to have a treaty, and what it's always meant, is to come from a self-determined place of what is your role and your responsibility, who you are, this deep identity, and to meet others, and then to live together and to build together. And that's happened on the land forever. So this understanding of process and relationship and this dynamic understanding of treaty is something that is much older than Canada, per se, and much older than original treaties between settlers and Indigenous peoples. It really, at least the understanding of treaties that came with Indigenous peoples was that original understanding of treaties on the land. And it came from how we interacted with the nations of wolves and the nations of chickadees and all of these other, really important and self-determining nations on the land. And I guess when I think about that, I think about ethical space. And ethical space has been such a formative concept for myself, and I think the most important thing that came from Pathway for me was ethical space. And the best way, I think, to explain it quickly is, a theoretical space between worldviews or between nations. So, often when we talk about it today because of where we live and the situation we're in, we talk about ethical space between Indigenous worldviews and Euro-Western worldviews because we're on Indigenous lands, but we are living in a colonial construct where our institutions are run largely from a Euro-Western perspective. So we talk about ethical space in that way, but there's ethical space in all kinds of different ways. And one that we talk about often is that, ravens, like you see ravens in a city or a town, and they're constantly eating garbage, and they're taking dog food, and they're, opportunists that are learning to find their way in a city, but it's not the same way that we relate to ravens. And we harvest, and we have always a lot of meat around our camp, but we don't have ravens that come in to steal from us because we have developed that relationship and treaty to have, again, those boundaries and those expectations. And they understand in a healthy and self-determined way what their role is and what our role is. And when we look at how ravens behave in a city, we see kind of the unhealthiness of these treaties that haven't been upheld from either end and largely from the human end. So when I think about that, I feel like Pathway was a small little glimpse into what this true meaning of treaty and ethical space could mean in Canada. And what we see on the land and, these understandings of treaty that we actually need if we ever have any hope of living in harmony on the land again, we have to find that. But in lots of ways, we're really, really far from it as a society. And I think what was so touching about Pathway is that we did get close to it, and we touched on it, and we felt it, and everybody felt it. And that's why it stuck so deeply in our hearts, I think. For me now, I look back and I say, how do we carry that on and have it continue? Because we, living on the land, that work of Pathway has not reached the governance of Wood Buffalo National Park, for instance. And I came out of the experience with a lot of hope and a lot of like true deep heart hope that we could make it happen. And it's, I think, as everybody knows, the bureaucratic challenges and the whole, we're living in this whole system that is not attuned to that true meaning of treaty. And though we got this little glimpse of it, yeah, I guess my thought and my challenge is how to make that little spark permeate more through society. And if we could do that, we would have success, because it really was touching on those deep fundamentals, I think, of what it means to live a good life on the land with other people and with ourselves as well, and identity. So the origin of Canada, I think, is integral to be thinking about and to understand when we think about Pathway, because it is about that meaning of treaty and of self-determination and of relationship and of process. So relationships that are ongoing, that continue to grow and move and shift those boundaries and those understandings. So I think that's all I have to say on that for now. Thank you. I think Allison as well, if you would like to add, we have another National Advisory Panel member here as well, so I feel like I should give a shout out if you want to add anything. No? Okay.
As I say earlier, I only have one train of thought, and my life walk now is preservation, respect, love, and thanking, just like the song for life. We talk about the celebration and the opening of us still being encircled today, from the celebration of how it came to be. Pathway, Target, they happened in ceremony. And that meant that there was a sacred fire and the people were called to circle. The gifts of the tobacco were offered through the ceremonial pipes and shared by the elders. When you do these kinds of things, feed and create and live spirit, bringing spirit to life, the one thing that we must understand through Indigenous and non-Indigenous, the promise that we made at that time. Ask ourselves, are we living up to that promise that we made at that ceremony when the pipes were offered? Or are we still just talking about it? And there's responsibility. So some of the responsibility in that time frame that I've learned, put a few more gray hairs on me, but that's all right. I think that as elders, we are not doing enough to integrate and to encourage non-Indigenous values to people, like to the non-Indigenous. How can we expect you to understand if we don't teach you? The first gift that came to sit with us today was thousands of years old. That was the wampum belt. We are not a written society. We never were. We didn't have the gift of alphabet that was alone for us to communicate. And we transitioned to that. So what I'm asking is a responsibility to reciprocate and learn the value without written words. Because the birds sing, you talk about the ravens knowing and respecting a treaty boundary between that relationship. If human and bird can understand that, what's the matter with us? We need to be more active about this. We need to light the next fire, because the first one was a sacred gift to all of us, to humanity, to the wellness of what we're here about, biodiversity. That is a responsibility. So I'm asking, as part of the next step forward, the second fire to be lit. The ashes preserved, as the firekeepers do, so that they can be carried on to the 3rd, the 4th, up to the 13th. And maybe by the time we get to the 13th fire, celebrating the 13 moons, our relationship and the governance through an Indigenous lens, not a 12-year calendar, but a 13. And each of those moon time and what the land does, the work that she does, as long as that spirit of that fire is celebrated, preserved, to carry it to the next governance, the next time. And those are things that we can look at in the moving forward in a respectful way. We're always in cities when we celebrate because it's the easiest thing to call us together. And it takes a lot of pressure, you know, to come here. I live in the bush, you know, but I got to the airport all by myself. It can be done. If I can get this far and get back home again. The impossible journey. So let's look at lighting the next fire. And the water bundles grow larger. And the celebrations be dispersed throughout the lands and the territory. We think about the strategies. I am most concerned about the ice in the north. Its spirit is dwindling and melting at a faster pace than what we even want to recognize. And I know that at one time this earth was covered and the shift of ice leaving the lands did happen. But it took a long time to do that, but not today. When I talk about living on the land and with the land and water, that's exactly what I do. Dedicate my life to that and talking about it. I haven't seen good ice since I was a young girl. 5, 6 years old when I go to school. The men used to harvest the ice for the summer refrigeration. So you figure you might be this tall. And the school principal scared us half to death so that we as children wouldn't go over where they were harvesting the ice. Told us if you fall in the water over there, they'll never find you because the water is 90 feet deep. That caring story from the school teacher, the principal, to keep us safe, stayed with me until I was in my 60s. So I drove the boat down to the local store, and I looked over and I'm thinking, wow, there isn't 90 feet of water. We're lucky if we got 6, because, and I didn't bump anything, you know. But it's, you know, that ice was tall like us, clear blue, solid. So we're talking 65 years ago and a little bit, and that's how fast it has changed. We should have ice. We don't have it. The water isn't cold enough in our own territories. So I'm encouraging and asking participation of the second fire. Miigwech.
I'm going to pass things to Curtis shortly, but in terms of recognition, the co-chair of the National Advisory Panel was, one of them was Cliff Supernaut, who kind of surprised me anyway, left this plane early. And recently I went to the Forest Stewardship Council General Assembly in Indonesia, and met Sandra Cardinal, who was a good friend. In fact, they were going golfing the next day. And I just, Cliff, I think Chloe would agree with me, and probably Allison, was, you know, just a special element in our work. And so I wanted to acknowledge Cliff's work. It was very important. Yeah, he's a spirit missed for sure. With that, I'm just going to pass over to you, Curtis.
Great. Thank you, Larry. In my haste to get through my intro, I forgot to do a few important things, which is to thank Elder Marilyn and Elder Larry for opening us in a good way, to recognize traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Mohawk people for allowing us to be here, as well as to thank my family for keeping the home fires burning, my wife Monique and my 2-year-old son Lake. A lot of what we're talking about is responsibility, and I didn't truly recognize that responsibility until I met him. And so now everything I do from this point forward is for future generations. It's for him, and much of the lessons that I've learned through Pathway, they came over me in waves when I met him. So suffice it to say that it's changed my life, as Dawn has said, in many, many profound ways. But to touch on the origin story, or the original question from Larry, you would have seen, many of you, if you've had a chance to look through the We Rise Together report, the focus of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, and I'm going to try and do that group justice, but talking about the origin story, I mean, we don't have to go into tremendous depths. Many of you know, the history is one of exploitation, one of dispossession, one of greed, of course, all rooted in colonization. It's a history that's really embodied this notion of management over domain of Mother Earth, of land. And I'm reminded, and I was so lucky to receive this teaching from Dr. Paulette Fox. It's from the Kainai Nation blood tribe in southern Alberta. She said to me, and as many of our elders do in such a matter-of-fact way, she said to me in the context of species at risk, she said, "We don't manage species, we maintain relationships. That's our job. That's why we're here." And that was one of many, many teachings that I've received over the last number of years in being involved in Pathway. And that is really what this has all been about. That's where this has come from. And much of what we talk about in the ICE report, reconciling that dark history, begins by naming it, begins by calling it out. We refer to it as the moose in the room. And it is that dark history. It's shining a light on the challenges as a means in creating a path to reconcile those challenges. And so we spent much time in conference with one another as members of the ICE. How do we do that in a way that's constructive? How do we do that in a way that doesn't place blame, that isn't about shaming those that came before us, but that is a place about profound learning? How do we build on what has been a very difficult foundation by which we all come to this problem with? And so we go into quite a depth there and at length about what that looks like, but more importantly, collectively, what does that maintenance of relationship mean to address that problem, to address that dark history, and write that second chapter, or begin to pay homage to that second fire. And so much of our time was spent looking at that. What does a relationship mean? What does love mean? What does respect mean? What does humility mean? And can we get by that? Can we get past that and begin to work with one another? We've heard from others about the role of ceremony, and maybe this is the last thing I'll say. I know time is getting away on us, but you can imagine a group of 100 people, if not more, at that initial ceremony, that pipe ceremony that we had to introduce Pathway. And some of you were in the room that were with us, but 100 folks, likely more, participating in a 3-hour pipe ceremony in Ottawa when we began. And suffice to say, it was a very warm afternoon, and only got warmer. And so it was a physical journey, a spiritual commitment that you could see transformation occurring from beginning to end. Of course, that's the role of ceremony, but the fact that so many folks entered that circle unsure of what they were getting themselves into, perhaps, but knowing that they had physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally transformed from beginning to end was a living embodiment and was a primary foundational commitment of the work that you've seen now play out since that time. So the power of ceremony, bringing people together, rooting people in one space, but keeping us connected, playing a role of that connective tissue, if you will, across the years and geographical boundaries and waters and lands that we inhabit, has really been the catalyst. It's been the nucleus for all of the good work that we've been doing over the last number of years, and really is a symbol of how we overcome that dark history, that origin story, that of course we all carry that burden, but we also carry so many options and opportunities and perspectives to resolve that and reconcile that. So I'll leave it there, Larry, and hand it back to you. Thank you.
Is it a good time for me to jump in now? I said, is it a good time for me to jump in now?
Sure.
And Miigwech, I didn't want to interrupt, but I want to say how much I appreciate all of you sharing, because I wasn't there at the beginning, so it's great to hear the experiences and what the pathway process meant for each of you. And I would just want to sort of go full circle and come back to Nadine. So I'm lucky enough that I now co-chair the National Steering Committee to Pathway to Target 1, which was kind of a result of the original We Rise Together, and then led to the actual report that created the committee. And at that point, Nadine and Scott started, and you left us very big shoes to fill, because I feel like right out of the process, the relationship was strong. I look at the records, I look at the information, I see the people around the table who were from that original pathway process speaking at NSC, and I can feel sort of what was created at that point. And when I say big shoes to fill, is because the priorities that came out from We Rise Together, and then the government response, there's 4 priorities, and they seem logical. Expand our network of protected areas, right? Do it with our Indigenous partners under ethical space. Think about the co-benefits, the outcomes, because it's not just about the number. It's about the quality of the conservation, yes, not conversation, the quality of the conservation, and how that conservation is going to lead to biodiversity thriving. And the last priority, doing that with the appropriate partners at the table. And so when I say big shoes to fill, as being the co-chair now with British Columbia, with my esteemed colleague Anthony Danks, who couldn't be here this week, we're trying to sort of carry that forward. And in ethical space, it means that my voice shouldn't be more important than my colleague's voice, and especially not more important than my Indigenous partner's voice at the table. So it's hard. We were talking about relationship. We have to nurture that relationship. It doesn't come on its own. The relationship that Chloe and her partner build with the animals around their camp, it doesn't just come naturally. They have to work at it. And I think that's something that we tend to forget. We work in a bureaucracy, and it's a meeting, and but that's not how it works. You need to have those conversations. I need to reach out to Curtis when I feel that I'm not hearing enough about his perspective. And it goes beyond that. It goes to the fact that we need to remind ourselves. I think we need to reinforce why is it we came together, reinforcing that one with nature and what we wanted to achieve through that, reinforcing the fact that we can't do it together and we can only move forward on our objectives for area-based conservation if we work together. And so what the origin story means for me, even though I wasn't part of the original pathway, and I come back to the wampum, to the original treaty of, you know, one spoon, one bowl, the idea is that every time we use, we exploit, if we use more than what we need, if we exploit more than what we need, if we accumulate riches, and you can translate that for yourself in whichever way you want, it means that we're mortgaging somebody else's ability to be able to meet their needs and to be able to strive in their area. So to me, that means we need to sort of step back with our partners and to determine what that balance is. So at the pathway, and it's sort of continued path forward, I think we need to take a look at ensuring that our Indigenous partners aren't just, I'll use the word token at the table, and that they have a stronger voice. I feel that relationship slowly not shining or burning as bright as it should, and I think we need to have more of these conversations, bring more partners to the table, and ensure that we all have strong voices in this ethical space that are equal to each other, and so we can find solutions together. Miigwech.
Miigwech, thank you. Okay. We've got a fair amount of territory to cover and what time we have left. And I want to open things up to questions that all of you might have. So I'm going to ask the panel to keep it brief, but we're going to talk about, and we've already kind of touched on it more than once, the implementation and the path forward. What you've seen in terms of efforts to date and lessons learned. Chloe, I know you have a few. And plans moving forward. We might want to even touch on the global framework. So with that, I'm going to go to you, Don.
I'll keep this brief, just looking at the time, because I love listening to everybody else up here. I'm really hopeful that in the next few days, we are going to land the next global biodiversity framework. I'm really hopeful about that. And Elder Marilyn, I really love what you were saying about let's light that next fire. I think we're at this moment in time when I'm thinking implementation to do that, to really reflect on what was started at the pathway, and we're going to be charged with moving fast to protect biodiversity in Canada getting up to 2030. So I think we have an opportunity to think about this conversation today and how to broaden and grow the tent and the voices to include Indigenous, non-Indigenous, but I think all people and organizations across sectors that have a responsibility to implement the next global biodiversity framework. And I don't think we included enough people when we started this process. I truly don't think. I think we need to grow that tent even broader. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to seeing what you do with this conversation, Julie, moving forward.
I feel the pressure. So you touched on some of the things I wanted to talk when I think of the future of a National Steering Committee and all the partners at the table, the provinces, the territories, our Indigenous partners, our municipal partners, Parks Council partners. I see some folks missing. And so I'm hopeful, like you, that we get sort of a strong framework to move forward so we can maybe reiterate our commitment to One with Nature, but maybe build on new commitments coming out of that framework. The National Steering Committee has done great work. They, provided tools, defined OECMs, and helped us understand what that means to recognize those activities that are already sort of contributing to biodiversity but might not be recognized. We have worked as Curtis, the co-chair of the IPCA working group, on defining what an IPCA, because it's not up to us feds to tell our Indigenous partners what an IPCA is. It's up to each Indigenous group to define that for themselves. I think there's still tons of work to be there, to do there. And finally, I think this idea of the missing members at the table, we need to take a closer look at that conversation and who needs to be part of that conversation if we want to advance area-based conservation quickly, but in a good way. And I think we'll need to do that together. And yeah, but I'm looking forward to the future, and I have a lot of hope.
I think, yeah, I see a real challenge with implementation, and I think the crux of it is, we're at this place where, just like you said, Julie, we have to move really fast to conserve biodiversity, to meet targets, and we can see just from where we are that the land doesn't have time for a long process, but yet what we need is a long process. And I don't have the answer to that. I just know that's a problem. And, if we are to sit down in ethical space, I think one of the biggest, I can pull out a pitfall that I know kept coming up for me and continues to come up for me, which is it's not just how are we going to protect a whole bunch of area. That in itself is a hard question. How are we going to do that? But if we're really working in an ethical space, the question becomes, what is effective protection? And that, I think a lot of people in the realm of conservation and biodiversity believe that is a very clear answer. There's a lot of questions, but that's not one of them. We know best practices of protecting land and what that means, but as Indigenous peoples, the removal of people and practices and the intertwinedness of being on the land in a big way, in a way where we do modify land, we do use land, we work with land, we harvest, that is conservation, and that is building those relationships that, again, move and change, and there's problems, and you go too far and you come back, but you understand those intricacies, and you can see where you can really feel out and understand those boundaries of those treaties. And I think we haven't even, we're starting to, in some spaces, have that conversation about what is effective protection, but I see it as a really important question going forward if we're to address ethical space in a good way and conservation in a good way. And that's all aside from, what are these targets and how do we get there? And so I would say just to not be blinded by a target of that we need to get to a space really quickly, because that's not necessarily what the land needs. And I think, Rob and I could probably say quite strongly from our perspectives, that's not what the land needs. And, it's, when I think about conservation, the best image that I can conjure is kids on the land, and kids from a young age building those relationships with the land. But therein lies the challenge of that the land doesn't necessarily have that time for our generations to grow up and build deep relationships. So we're in an interesting pickle, and I wish I had an answer, but I think it's just important to see where we are and to think through implementation in, I think what everybody said so far is a broader sense. Instead of going just forward with blinders on, I think it's essential that we open up that view to other voices and to the tough conversations that other voices bring, which is what is actually the right way forward, and what does the land need and why. So yeah, it's really close to me for sure, because I kind of touched on it already, but from our position living on the land, I really did arrive at that space with a lot of hope in my heart from Pathway, and feelings that things were going to move in a great direction, and then realizing that Pathway was a little bit of a bubble where we were able to build something that was beautiful and important and affected us so deeply. I think it gives me hope to know that everybody that was part of that process has gone forth in the world and is continuing to think about it as best we can in our context. And I continue to have conversations with many different people that were involved in Pathway, and I'm assured that we're all percolating and thinking about how we can apply it in our own context. And I think maybe that's how social change can work and ripples can work, where you know, we each have this little piece, and now we can work with others and bring in more voices in our expanded into our many different roles, and maybe there's some good that can come of that. Thank you.
Miigwech. I listened to you, Julie, right? Talking about how she needs to write a report, put words down. So I'm going to call upon the two-eyed seeing, the vision of our Mashom, Albert Marshall. Thinking in two ways. So you're talking about writing words, and I've done extensive work in the land and looking at the ancient writings, the pictographs. We don't know how to read them, but as you were talking about the depth of the writing, a picture came in my mind about the things that are being discussed here today. So if it was I who were writing in the Indigenous value, I would think about the male carrying the ashes and getting ready for the next fire. That's how the picture would look. The paints that our ancestors used, they're still there, thousands and thousands of years later. Let's do that kind of a footprint too. We have the knowledge. We have 28 people in our territory, young people, that carry the knowledge of how to do the painting. Youth. Miigwech.
Great, thanks, Larry. Try to keep it brief. Picking up on Chloe's point, right? Taking time to make time, right? It's not an easy thing to do, and something that we did experience in a bit of a bubble in Pathway, in NAP, in ICE. So really, really mindful of that, and I thank Chloe for bringing that up. I think as well, again, touching on one of Chloe's points, I've always viewed the targets as a means rather than an end. They are to provide, serve as a catalyst for supporting broader efforts in Indigenous-led conservation in particular. And so really, understanding that the last decade of conservation work has been challenged in that it hasn't woven that holistic approach, the rights and the inherent rights, title, responsibilities, and jurisdiction of Indigenous peoples was not really married throughout the last set of targets, right? We had a sole focus on 17%, and a few other targets that followed, but certainly not the full complement of targets in the previous action plan. And so really thinking about that and being mindful of what we've heard and lessons that we've learned in that regard. And as of late, thinking more about how we uncouple our understanding of Indigenous-led conservation from those targets, from area-based targets in particular, right? Looking at area-based conservation is a very short-sighted view of understanding the full potential of Indigenous-led conservation. And I think collectively, globally, as a society, we're getting to that point. We're starting to understand that. And that is a new narrative that is coming about and that will inform, ideally, a much more energized global biodiversity framework that recognizes that. And then finally, reflecting on ICE itself and the process that led to and the governance that had sort of come to support the Indigenous Circle of Experts. The thought is not lost on me that in early days, that Indigenous Circle of Experts was intended to be only a working group, one component of 7 within the Pathway Initiative, and it was only through some very deep and long conversations by my director and mentor, Tony Osadik, in his role, but working with Nadine and company to say that this is one opportunity to elevate the profile of Indigenous leadership and conservation, to elevate the voices of Indigenous thought leaders within a broad architecture that was the Pathway. And we were very lucky in having those conversations with Nadine that we were able to craft that space to create the Indigenous Circle of Experts on par with the National Advisory Panel and on par with the National Steering Committee to provide that advisory role to the ministers. And so I think it's important to note that it was an opportunity that took some work. It was some back and forth, and we were able to create a wonderful group that I keep pointing to that book in front of you all, and I'm biased, I know, but it's an incredible tool that was created through those difficult conversations, through those partnerships with federal, provincial, territorial representatives, with many, many Indigenous thought leaders around the table. And something that I've said in other forums, and I think it's relevant here, that set of recommendations is an incredibly useful tool. And somewhere along the way in our implementation and our governance considerations, right, we created that wonderful tool, and then we sent the architects home. Right, we sent the mechanic home, if you will, is another way of looking at it, right? And so we've created a number of recommendations, and what stemmed from that in the implementation phase has been conversations about what do we mean, what are IPCAs in practice, how do partners recognize that, how do partners lift that up jurisdictionally, conservation allies and others, what does that look like? And I know that that's a very live conversation and would benefit in a very substantial way if we had continued and carried forward with the ICE, with the NAP, with groups of folks that spent 12 months in the weeds thinking about what might this concept look like, and had not had to this point the benefit of continuing that and carrying that legacy forward. There's been a lot of tremendous work that have been done by partners through the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, the ECCC Lam Foundation, Plenty Canada, Nature for Justice, Stephen Nita, the work that he's been doing. It's wonderful work, and it's incredible, and it's carried the legacy of the ICE report. But imagine where we would be if we had been able to keep that group, those architects in the room, to say, how do we do this on the ground now, and how do we bring more voices in? How do we make this a more inclusive conversation for those rights holders on the ground who want to realize what an IPCA looks like and what it means for them beyond targets, beyond area-based conservation. And so I think now's the time when we're imagining this renewal, this next phase. What does it look like to bring some of those voices back together and start working out the nuts and bolts of how we realize this new target, but also realize that the process, the pathway is far more important, and the cumulative impact and effects of all of those smaller initiatives that are outside this, a quantum, if you will, but that are the quality of conservation, are going to get us to a much more meaningful place. Whether it is that 30% target, I think there's going to be much more representativeness there, and we're going to bring so many more people along with us.
Awesome, Curtis. Okay, so we're going to take a little bit of time and invite you to ask any questions you might have, and with any of the panelists. So I'm just going to open it up. Is anybody? Allison.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Elder Larry, and everybody for all your remarks. And thank you, Chloe, for inviting me. I had to sit here and think a little bit and process and listen before I was willing to speak. But I just want to share, and building off of Curtis's comments, I think that this was the most profound experience I've ever had in my lifetime of working in conservation. And to me, the most impactful part of this process was the lesson about connecting the heart and the head in our work. I come from a, louder? Okay, sorry. I come from a, in my life, my background is very much where we were taught to work from our heads and to learn, and in a construct that we think and we separate. We leave our hearts at home in many ways. We don't bring them to the office. And the most profound part to me was working in ceremony. And I know at one point I remember saying, when we were standing around the fire at the end of the day and talking about the experience of the day, and I think I remember saying, Larry, when every time when I'm in this process, every time I open my mouth, I don't know what's going to come out because I'm so not used to connecting my heart and my head, and I'm not good at speaking from the heart because it's not my experience. And so
I think the, you know, even I've worked in many processes where there have been many people around the table and many different interests around the table. But what makes that conversation profoundly different is the ceremony, is the connecting the heart and the head when people are open to those conversations and to thinking about a profoundly different way of working and a profoundly different way of moving forward. And being part of this was an absolute gift. It transformed me, and I don't carry it forward as well as I should, because I think we do fall back into old patterns. And I think the big challenge is to bring that spirit forward. And I just note that, you know, yesterday as we were going around the table with all the CPAWs, I work for the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and we had a big group here this week, and all of the events that we held were creating space for Indigenous peoples to share their stories, or that was our intent and our effort. I remember yesterday I just said at the end of our go-round that, you know, what I've learned is that conservation is fundamentally about relationship. I wouldn't have said that, I don't think, in that meeting if it hadn't been for the pathway process. And so it's a profound learning, and I do challenge everybody to care, and I make a commitment to myself to do better at carrying that spirit forward as we move forward, because I think that, to me, is the fundamental difference that gift of the pathway process really brought to me and to others. So thank you.
Jimmy Gwetch for those heartfelt comments, Allison. Anybody else? And even if it's a reflection, not a question, feel free. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you all. It's really good. Louder. Good. Right on. All right. Yeah, thank you for all of those words this morning. It was great to hear all of that. There's some of it is really intriguing to me, and I have probably too many questions to be answered in this point. And to make sure there's space for everybody here. But the concept, and I think I heard it a couple different ways when you were speaking, Chloe, about some of the relationship, like the treaty with the animals and living on the land and seeing, you know, thinking about conservation as seeing kids on the land, that sort of thing. I think also hearing you speak about the how did you put it? I think it was related to that area-based conservation is a bit short-sighted. There's something more to it than that. I see those two comments sort of, in at least the way I'm interpreting them, is related to each other a bit. And I just wanted to kind of probe into that a little bit, especially, you know, so what I lead in, I'm with the Alberta government. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister of Lands there. One of the big pieces of work that we lead out of that group is conservation efforts related to caribou recovery. So land planning is our vehicle of how to do that. And it's been a conversation to find ways to get the system of all the parts to work together, not so much to say this part is going to be for this piece and this part is going to be for this piece. It's like it's trying to look at it as the whole system. I'm sure we don't have it right, and we try to make it, you know, better every time we move ahead. We're making progress that we hadn't made for a long time in that conversation. But my main question is, you know, if you could expand maybe a little bit on what's beyond the area-based conversation? What does that mean to you? Rather than so that's the context I have for asking that question, and I'd just like to hear what that means to you, and to anyone if you've got an opinion on that. But that would be great. Thank you.
Great question. I think I said to me, it's the crux of the conservation conversation today. And I found, and I still find, we hit that question all the time, so it's awesome that you brought it out again. I guess I could answer it like in terms of caribou, which is, caribou are really important to us in the north, and caribou are important everywhere, and it's a big topic of conversation and a difficult one. And when I think about caribou conservation, I think about our roles and responsibilities on the land, and people have harvested caribou as our role. The caribou have been there as a food source for us, and so there's, I think, a lot of different factors that contribute to the decline of caribou, but not least of all is that humans have abandoned our roles and our responsibilities around caribou. We don't, when we're harvesting a food, there's so much more that goes into just, the shooting of an animal. There's, the long processes and the work and the love that goes into that harvest and skinning and butchering, and the time that we take every time we harvest an animal, the words that we speak of love, and oh, that meat is so good. And that caribou, they, as their nation and with our treaties, we understand each other and we give back, again, that understanding of, what humans get from the caribou and what caribou get from humans. And that system has so many little rabbit holes you could go down, people on the land following caribou, harvesting caribou. Well, we really know what caribou need on a much deeper level if you're there every day and you're understanding and you're seeing them and you're tasting the meat and you're seeing up close, the little changes in their bodies or their changes with the seasons. And to have lost that, I think, is a really big part of what's gone wrong with caribou. And so for my part, when I think about caribou, it was, I guess, 5 years ago I harvested my first caribou. And it was just 3, and it was a big effort for myself, but it was the most love possible I could give to the caribou, the most growth for myself, the most important understanding of what we needed to move forward. And to me, that's conservation at its best. And I think for us living on the land, we have that understanding in a lot of different ways, and that the best we can do is to maintain those relationships and those roles, and to understand ourselves in the context of self-determined in our roles and relationships on the land. Because if we can't see ourselves that way, we can't see the other species and nations that way. And once we've lost that self-determination and are in a kind of unhealthy patterns of dependency, there's a lot that cascades and goes wrong. And I think we're pretty far down that path at this point. So how to get it back on a larger scale, I'm not 100% sure, but I do know it has to do with roles and relationships, and examining what those are in your area around caribou would be a really interesting place to start. Not how do we save the caribou, but deeper questions about what does our relationship look like, what has it look like, and how can we bring elements of that in a sustainable way to where we are now, which is in a really diminished population of caribou. Hope that helps.
Thank you. Jumping again here. Thanks, Larry. No, I really appreciate that question, and it's a really important question, and struggling not to give you a million answers and think of 2 good ones. For me, anyways, when I present that as what's more than the targets, conservation is about more than those targets. I've had the unique experience of seeing the thought and the consideration that goes into those projects, those IPCAs that have been supported through the Nature Legacy and present. And I know there's been some difficult conversations occurring there, and there were many, many, many projects that were and proposals that were brought forward that simply because they weren't of a great enough quantity or quantum hectares protected, they were not funded. I mean, there were a number of other reasons, but that was one of them. How much are we protecting? We're striving so quickly and moving so quickly to get to 17%, you know, and that was the sole focus. So immediately seeing that happen, to me, started breaking things down in their component parts, right? And one of the things that we carried through the ICE process and in our regional engagements, we had, you know, said size doesn't matter when we're talking about IPCAs, when we're talking about Indigenous-led conservation. It's about the priorities, it's about the interests, it's about the implementation of our self-determination in those areas, whatever that may look like and whatever that may be. Yet when we see funding that's been supporting projects, it's been for those larger IPCAs that have been proposed, right? So that initially kind of got the wheel turning for me that there's a problem here in how we're imagining this. And unfortunately, due to that, we had a number of nations, a number of proposals that came forward over the last number of years. You know, I think the initial Nature Fund was oversubscribed by about $800 million. So that tells us that there's a lot of work at a much smaller scale that is of equal value, if not more, if we're thinking about and looking beyond just that 17% target, that 25, and now that 30. And so my mind has always kind of revolved around what are we missing? How are we bringing those nations along? How do we maintain that momentum? And how are we doing it in a way that's decoupled? And so when I think about decoupling that from the target, it's a lot of what Chloe has just said. I look at the component parts of Indigenous-led conservation initiatives, or IPCAs. It's culture, it's language revitalization, it's conservation economies. It may be all of those, or it may be one of those. And I think that's what we've kind of missed a bit in terms of looking at just a hectares-based approach. I'm imagining, you know, language and cultural revitalization projects that are their conservation. That's conservation at its best, but it's not particularly area-based at all times, right? So rethinking how we're imagining what Indigenous-led conservation initiatives look like that are beyond just place-based, and looking at the component parts of that work, for me, is sort of how we answer that. And one of the really good examples that I often think of is the work that the Vuntut First Nation is doing in Yukon to protect the porcupine caribou herd. Of course, they're fighting for the protection of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but that transcends boundaries. It's a migratory herd. So it's not simply just place-based. It's not protect one area. It's protect the entire migratory route. And how do we do that, or how are they doing that? It's rooted in culture. It's rooted in language. It's rooted in traditional and sustainable livelihoods. That is a prime example, at least in much of the work I've been close to, of Indigenous-led conservation that is beyond simply area-based targets, right? And so if we add up those component parts, I think we get a better whole. And so that's where my mind is sort of going in terms of what does this next iteration of post-2020 global biodiversity framework look like? In particular, what does it look like when we're talking about domestic implementation here in Canada?
Okay. I see you have a mic. No? Okay, we're all set. Anybody? Last call? Okay. In that case, I'm going to give, you know, a few sentences to the panelists for last thoughts, final thoughts.
I think my message that I'd love to share with everybody in this room is just to have courage in the work that you do. I think listening to the people on this panel and how the Pathway to Canada Target 1 transformed the way we do our work, personally and professionally. It changed even how I relate to my own children. But we need to bring that kind of heart, the heart and mind. We need to have courage to bring that into our work so that we can actually accelerate how we can serve and do a better job at loving and being on the land. So bring that courage.
So well said. I guess the last words I would like to leave is sort of thinking of ethical space and all that. You have to start with yourself first. And I do that in my everyday life with my husband. We try to be minimalist. We don't waste. You know, there's leftover cranberry sauce from Thanksgiving. We dried it in a dryer and made fruit roll-ups for my daughter. You know, this idea that we need so little to live, and that to live well, we need to be connected to nature, to the animals around us. Last night, an elder was telling a story and saying, when we think of the beaver, we don't just think of the beaver. We think of where the beaver lives. We think about what the beaver eats. We think about what eats beaver. We think about, you know, what's our relationship to the beaver and our role in respecting and honoring the beaver. I think that idea of starting with yourself and then moving from there and keeping an open mind and nurturing our relationships with nature, with our partners, I think that's where we start.
I would build on that, I think, because it is really important about how ethical space starts with ourselves. And, you know, if we want to be voices for the land and for nature, we need to think about, you know, what are our credentials to be doing that? Do we have a relationship with the land where we really know what the land needs? And sometimes it's almost easiest to think about it as a relationship with a partner or a spouse, or, you know, you wouldn't be away for a year and then come back and start giving orders about what to do. You know, you actually have to be present and understanding with each of the nations of animals. And I think there's small ways that we can all do that individually, taking time for ourselves to be outdoors, and not just to be outdoors to be recreating, but to be really listening and immersing ourselves. And, you know, if you aren't able to do that, or to the extent that you think you need to really understand, ask the people that are, because there are people that live on the land, and they might not necessarily be tied into political circles or the conversations that happen around tables, but there are certainly all over Canada people with that knowledge. And so I think, you know, it's kind of a twofold way of listening to the land, is work on it for yourself and find those people and listen to those people that really are that conduit between what the land is telling us and what natural law is telling us, and where we need to go with conservation. And I guess just like Curtis, from your question, there's so much circling, but I think the other thing that comes out is that, you know, area-based conservation is based on borders on the land, which is a fundamental cut from natural law. The land doesn't see borders, and animals move and they migrate, and climate shifts and changes, seasons change. It's all about change and flow. And I think that when I think about conservation, I think anything that can align with the flow is maybe, you know, what the land tells us. But yeah, as much as possible, we need to find ways to be listening to the land. Thank you so much. Tauna.
You ladies are a hard act to follow. This dress isn't just a dress. Heard this knocking on the door, and it was the elders. Not one, not two, there was a bunch of them. And just when you think you know everything, they come to teach you more. So this dress is all about biodiversity and their concerns. Each color means something, so I've got a lot of learning to do, to take time again to sit down with my teachers. So when you were talking about the harvesting of animals, these two colors here are the animals. This green means that the harvest is finished. To be responsible enough to take the remains, the hooves, and put them back where that animal walked. The next green is the food for the new four-leggeds that will be born. That's just a little bit in the colors. I still have lots of learning to do. So you girls sure rock. Okay, miigwech.
Thank you, Larry. Last words. I think something I've said in many, many circles that I've been in, and again, it comes back to our teachings and what you've heard from Elder Marilyn and Elder Larry already, eternal hope, I guess, is the way that I always look at it. A lot of our stories and our teachings, there is no choice but to continue to move forward, to be resilient, to do the work for future generations. And so I think for all of us, even leaving here at the end of this conference and whatever form the negotiations leave, it's that hope and that perseverance and that resilience that comes from that we carry forward. And we all have a particular responsibility and role to play in that. And so for me, that's what keeps us going. The hope that I have in working with Dawn and Julie and Chloe, and the love is there for the work and for the people and for all of you, and it's reciprocal in that way. So I think we have to remind ourselves of that, no matter how difficult things get, to focus on the light, focus on what's possible, focus on the young people, and take guidance from our elders. So keeping that in mind and knowing that we can carry forward and we can work collectively together to achieve something better, or certainly to leave things better than we found. So really rooting ourselves in our teachings and believing in one another. And that's what ceremonies taught us, to believe in one another, to commit to one another, and to commit to Mother Earth. So thank you all, Nyawa, for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Jimmy Gwitch, Curtis. I'm mindful of the time, and we're going to wrap things up. Emily, do you have those gifts?
Yeah, they're in the other room.
Okay, all right. So we're going to share some gifts with the panelists, but in view of the time, we'll do it when we leave here. But I want to say something very quickly about gift giving. I said it in the final ceremony when we passed the bundle to Minister McKenna. The thing about gift giving, natural law, is it connects us to truth. The truth is we are part of a web of life. I wish I could quote the Canada's Conservation Vision, the NAP, Recommendation 1, second or third bullet. We're one species among many. And we are my elders always said, we are no more important than the smallest insect. Every species has a job to do. And it's through our heart connecting with our mind, making that connection to those species, that we understand that. We understand it more than intellectually. And for me, as I listen to Chloe and I think about the time I get to spend on the land, for some unique reasons, I got more time this year than I have in a long time. And there's so much that happens in that connection that goes beyond our intellectual understanding. And so, and ceremony helps us, in my case, putting my tobacco down, sitting in the bush before I harvest a tree. And I was just actually with Nadine's people, and elders there, well, Joe Martin talked about how once upon a time, if somebody was going to harvest a tree for a canoe, they would spend 4 months contemplating harvesting that one tree. And we've gotten faster, quicker, more efficient, but in so doing, we've lost that connection. We've lost that sensitivity, that understanding. And so I think what I heard from this panel is that we have to find ways of bringing that connection. And I'm going to say, Allison, you spoke to it beautifully. We need to, as part of targets in writing, we need to find out, how do we pass on the empathetic responsibility associated with what's in writing? That's pretty doggone tricky, but it does require ceremony. It requires slowing things down and making sure that we have the opportunity to make true connections, whether it's here under these lights in the city or it's out on the land. And I agree with Chloe. I've always tried to just take time where I don't have a cell phone, no way anybody can reach me, and I recharge, I reconnect, and it's important we find our ways, those small ways, and we heard some beautiful stories. Julie, I liked your story. Those little things you do as a family that connect, and they give you strength in doing the work that you're doing, we're doing. And so with that, Marilyn's going to do Traveler's Song. I'm going to partially close the traveling song. We'll complete it. Kwekwe Kijimanadu, Chimigwech, Anik Mishomas Benang, our ancestors who brought their wisdom here, and we released them. And Chimigwech to all of you for making this circle as best we could with the size of room strong. And let's all work together. Let's all commit and pledge to honoring our first responsibility, which is the continuation of life. And we're so blessed to have this life. So with that, I'm gonna turn things over to Marilyn. I'm gonna kind of rudely, because I know we gotta be out of this room, and I'm gonna pack up as Marilyn sings. I understand, almost forgot this, that once we leave the room, I've got a note here that says something about attendees can be invited to move to other areas for follow-up conversations. I don't know what that looks like. It's there. Maybe something will happen. Oh, I see. Okay. Oh, out here. Oh, awesome. Okay. 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 Miigwech.
Oh, you fix your bundle. In our language, there are many words that we don't have words for, and goodbye is one of them. We simply didn't know what goodbye was, or to give something away. Life. And we have a song to honor all of the ways, the roads, the trains, the planes, the voices. And I again thank the men for that ethical space of travel and taking care of us. Way, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, way, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, way, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, way, oh, hey, way, oh, hey, oh, way. Mishomas. Miigwech Shabalado. Miigwech no Kamasaka. Miigwech. So simply, we'll see you the next time. And thank you to the technical support. You make us sound good.